It is my pleasure to introduce now my friend and colleague and beloved climate change podcast co-host, Ben Joshua Davis. I'm pleased to introduce him to all of you. Ben has been sort of behind the scenes for most of this conversation. Ben serves as the BTS Center's Director of Applied Research, and he's the one on our team who consistently is saying to us, people, we need to get to know so-and-so. Or, have you seen this article yet? Or, this book seriously speaks to what we're trying to do here at the BTS Center. And Ched Myers was one of those thinkers who Ben said we must get to know. And he was right. So we've asked Ben to introduce Ched to all of you and then to engage in conversation with him as part of this closing session of Convocation. Ben.
Thank you, Nicole, for that really gracious introduction. And it is such an honor to officially welcome Ched Myers into this conversation space with us. As it turns out, this is actually the second time that Ched has presented to the BTS community, having spoken to us 20 years ago when we were Bangor Theological Seminary. Ched and I were introduced to each other through a mutual friend earlier this year. And if you've read his bio on our website, you'll already know that he is an accomplished scholar, theologian, and activist. However, in the very first conversation that I had with Ched, I learned a few extra things about him that I think you all will experience today as well. First, Ched's wisdom is born from deep on-the-ground experience. As someone who spent decades as a community organizer and who, since 2005, has apprenticed himself to the land where he lives, practiced eco-justice, and taught about discipleship that is shaped by our watersheds and about the spiritual journey of decolonization. Secondly, I discovered that Ched deeply, truly cares about theologically interpreting this moment that we're in, about forming a new generation of transformational leaders, and about inviting people within his own tribe in particular, Christians, to practice radical accountability to the poor and to the oppressed, which includes both our human and non-human kin. Finally, I was reminded when we talked that Ched had already practiced for a long time so much of what I hoped we would model as an organization, and also what I wanted to embody in my own life. One of the things that I've learned is that we all need elders, people who have been on the journey and learned something, whose wisdom comes from the rich soil of their experience, who can offer us grounded guidance as we begin to claim our vocation as spiritual leaders in a climate changed world. And Ched is one of these people. Now, please, Ched, note that I said elder, not elderly. Ched will begin by engaging today with that wild book of liberatory poetry that Shannon Schaub mentioned earlier today, the book of Revelation, most specifically chapters 21 and 22. The theme of his talk is Creator Tented Among Us in a Watershed World, Ancient Visions and Fierce Imagination for Intergenerational Struggle. That's a title which I hope makes you as excited to hear what he has to offer as I am. After Ched offers some wisdom to us, Ched and I will be in conversation with each other and with you all as well. So Ched, what word do you have to share with us today? And Ched, if I can give you the traditional Zoom gathering greeting, you need to unmute your mic.
Wow, rookie mistake. Thanks, and good evening, everybody. Very honored to offer this final reflection after this rich time of convocation and conversation. Thanks to you, Ben, and Nicole, Alan, Kay, Ash, the whole BTS leadership crew for this opportunity to be in your circle. I really enjoyed participating in the convocation from out here on the West Coast, and I'm sure my box will arrive any day now. Thanks to Reggie for the great music, and I'd like to dedicate this session to our mutual friend, Kate Stevens, community singer and curator of Wilderbrook Farm in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. Appreciate all of you for hanging in there to the end of this convocation. I'm beaming to you from the Ventura River watershed, the heart of unceded and untreated Chumash land in California. As settlers here, we seek to be accountable to a legacy of colonial genocide, to ongoing social and racial disparities, and now to an 8-year drought, the most dramatic harbinger of climate crisis in our place. In this watershed, we seek to pursue, as you do in your place, the faith-rooted vocation of nurturing beloved community and sustainable and just lifeways amidst the multiple interlocking crises facing our society and God's creation. And hopefully, in the conversation following, we can parse some of those practices. But let's establish coordinates by stating the matter plainly one more time. The facts point to a terminal diagnosis for our civilizational dis-ease. This slide plots the infamous hockey stick curve across some 24 different indices, including human population levels, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, exploitation of fisheries, destruction of tropical forests, paper consumption, number of motor vehicles, water use, rate of species extinction, and of course, rising global temperatures. The same kinds of graphs can plot growing racial, socioeconomic disparities. This convocation is asking how our faith communities can equip our people to face and change the blasphemous collective behaviors that are bearing down upon us like hockey sticks. Leonard Berg articulates the ultimatum in terms of a classic 12-step framework. Acknowledging our dis-ease is the only way to healing. Scripture too presses that kind of tough love, which most of our postmodern discourses strive to avoid. Consider Jesus' axiom that only those who know they are diseased will seek healing. He goes on to clarify that his call is not directed to those who imagine there is nothing fatally flawed about their personal or political worlds, because denial is the enemy of discipleship, but rather to those who are ready to repent. That venerable, if typically sentimentalized, biblical verb named by Alan in your opening session yesterday, which means the hard work of turning around our personal and political histories. To do this, we must face the unspeakable, as the great contemplative Tom put it during the darkest days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. At a moment when our parents and grandparents were facing existentially a different kind of end of the world, Merton asserted that Christian hope begins where all other hope stands frozen stiff before the face of the unspeakable. Of course, today nuclear weapons still threaten us, even as we reckon now with the new face of the unspeakable in climate catastrophe. Unfortunately, we North Americans still know a lot more about the frozen stiff paralysis Merton diagnosed than we do about the kind of hope he intoned. As we've heard throughout this convocation, those of us with race, class, and gender privilege have a lot to learn about unfreezing hope from our resilient siblings in marginalized communities. Adrienne Marie Brown, who's been invoked several times over the convocation, for example, in her very different assertions, similarly invokes apocalyptic rhetoric. Apocalypsis, as you know, means to unveil. But from her perspective as a Detroit-based activist and social movement doula, BIPOC and queer bodies have always faced displacement and violence from the white supremacist body politic of settler colonialism. So for her, things have not gotten worse, they've just gotten uncovered. She then challenges us to hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil, to face and engage the unspeakable, which seems a good definition of our vocation as people of faith and conscience. Here, though, I want to explore the fierce hope and imagination of voices far older. My deep conviction is that because our civilizational crisis has been brewing for millennia, it's going to take the imaginary of ancient deep traditions for us to turn it around. My work is to look particularly to the prophets and poets of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. This is an approach that contrasts with inventing a new religion, as protagonist of the parable of the sower did, as we heard earlier today. But my more traditionalist approach has already been invoked beautifully by Keisha McKenzie in the last session. Old stories have a track record of helping folk overcome, and they're still sung and told by communities. That is an intergenerational scaffolding of hope. We have the vocabulary of both lament and hope. So my reflections will underline themes that have been already aired in the Convocation, and I just want to point to a few other traditions that will be useful, hopefully, to try and for those still trying to make sense of and renew the vitality of Judaism and Christianity under climate crisis. For example, the 11th chapter of Genesis named our civilizational disease primally and archetypally as the Tower of Babel. This tale narrates the emergence of imperial states in ancient Mesopotamia that surrounded the Semitic tribes of the Levant. Babel symbolizes that toxic strain of human social organization that centralizes power, constructs hierarchical architecture and social systems, enforces monocultural conformity, they all spoke one language, exerts centrifugal reach to extract resources and labor from the peripheries, drawing them everyone to the land of Shinar, and presumes a cosmic sense of entitlement, rising to the heavens. In other words, pretty much the story of civilization as we in the West know it. This mythic tower reflected ancient realities, of course, such as the ziggurat culture of the Sumerians, whose heavy boot print on the earth is still visible 6,000 years later. Another example of a critical unmasking imaginary is the Exodus story of systemic oppression, ecological rebellion, and divinely empowered liberation, which narrates how the plagues of empire, oppression, violence, greed, lead inexorably to plagues on empire. That saga also articulated mythically ancient historical realities. Jared Diamond has shown how overexploitation of resources led to ecological and political collapse of history's first agricultural empires in the Fertile Crescent, which is precisely the conclusion of scientist James Lovelock concerning our modern biospheric crisis. We are witnessing, he wrote a decade ago, the revenge of Gaia. The resonance between these ancient stories of scripture, the oldest resistance literature in the world, and modern ecological ultimatums is sobering. Nature did and still does rebel against imperial presumption to rule over it, sometimes slowly, sometimes dramatically, but always inevitably. One finds this radical imaginary in the Second Testament as well, not only in the gospel narratives of Jesus, but also from his followers, such as the prisoner Paul, who pulled back the veil under a different empire 2 millennia ago. Now, Paul tends to be stereotyped according to his seemingly severe critique of human oppression. The wages of sin are death, for example, though that actually only articulates another 12-step type ultimatum. But in Ephesians, the apostle is portrayed as betting his life on the mystery of how Christ forged cosmic peace by building a bridge on his back. Amidst the terrors of the Roman Empire, Paul, himself a former terrorist, knocked down and transformed by the voice of his victims on the Damascus Road, embraced the work of building restorative and beloved community, drawing on the imaginary of an executed and risen Jesus of Nazareth. But for the rest of this reflection, I want to focus on John the Revelator, already invoked by our Muslim sibling Shannon Shaw. Amazing. John was also a political exile, and his spectacular vision was, like Paul's, called an apocalypsis. A quick word about this apocalyptic way of seeing. It involves a double unmasking. On one hand, the realities of injustice are being uncovered, thus Adrienne Marie Brown's trope. On the other hand, the possibilities of a different way of being are being glimpsed. Cole Arthur Riley alluded to the challenge of holding these tensions, and yet how crucial this dialectic is, moving, as Rob Hopkins was saying, from what is to what if. This kind of double vision, having eyes to see, as Jesus repeatedly puts it, is the incubator of radical hope whenever history has seemed on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But it has arisen not from the privileged spaces of empire, as Berenice pointed out in her sermon yesterday, but from the bowels of oppression. I'm trying to make a case here, friends, that the old imaginary of our scripture can animate our churches and others of faith and conscience to face and heal our disease. John the Revelator's vision saw through the powerful propaganda of the Pax Romana in order to unmask the realities of its victims. This included famously naming the four horsemen of empire in Revelation 6, an ancient way of speaking about the intersectionality of systemic violence. This resonates profoundly with our greatest American prophet, Martin Luther King Jr., who described 55 years ago the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism in his famous Breaking the Silence speech, delivered exactly 1 year to the hour before he was assassinated by his own government. Nor was John afraid to call out Rome as the beast, nor in Revelation 18 to rejoice in the prospect of Babylon's fall, the demise of a system that trafficked in Earth's resources and human lives. Shades of Genesis 11. So much lament in this old text, but also so much hope. It's the Revelator's imaginary concerning liberation and restoration in Revelation 21-22 that I commend for closing our convocation. I want to offer a meditation on two magnificent visions of returning to the earth as home that might inspire and empower us to heal our epidemic dis-ease of imperial homelessness. The first image is often overlooked. The Creator resuming residence in our midst in a tent. In Revelation 21, which, by the way, is a text you'll get to preach on, some of you, this coming Sunday, January 1st, how appropriate. There we find a remarkable vision of the world transfigured back to communion as a new Jerusalem descends from heaven to earth, not as most spiritualizing theologies have it, the other way around. See, the tent of God is among mortals, and God will tent with them and dwell with them. I want to lift up this doubly reiterated detail. Creator tenting among us. Of course, it echoes a more famous trope found in John's gospel, that incarnational image of the word becoming flesh. That's what gets most of our theological attention, such that we again miss the grounding placement of that word. The Greek term eskinosin means made an encampment, or as the old Baptist radical Clarence Jordan put it, pitched a tent among us. This metaphor heralds a renewal of the old ways of our people before we were colonized by empire, inhabiting not permanent built environments, but liminal dwelling close to the ground and its conditions. These images appeal to the deep history of Israel, the wilderness tradition of the Exodus. In fact, tents are mentioned more than 300 times in the Hebrew Bible. And this memory is important still in Judaism, celebrated annually in Sukkot, the Feast of Tents, as a communal ritual of remembering origins. This trope is invoked throughout the Second Testament as well. For example, the 3 tents of the Transfiguration Mount are still venerated in Eastern Orthodox spirituality. Or perhaps somewhat more obscurely, Jesus' parable about the struggle between God and mammon in Luke 16, a lectionary text some of you might have preached on last month. Decoding his story about a dissident manager who defects from the master system in order to build alliances with the very villagers who the master exploits, Jesus warns, when, not if, the mammon system fails you, you'll have to rely on the deeper, stronger traditions of community hospitality, symbolized by the old tent life. Note that Jesus' focus is nostalgic here, but eschatological. It's a vision of future life restored to sanity and communion. So too in Revelation. John imagines the tent of divine homecoming, Creator's solidarity with earth and her inhabitants. The Creator is fully committed to our biosphere. Even might here be viewed as setting up some sort of protest camp among us, refusing to move until we get healed? Because, as the young climate activists like to say, there is no planet B. So how might we reimagine John's metaphor in our world? The ancient Hebrew cosmology understood the world as dwelling under a firmament, that is, a kind of a tent, not too far from our modern idea of living within a biospheric bubble. So we might well interpret the Revelator's image cosmically, God reunited with earth and us, creation as our tent home, the only future we have. But in the meantime, we might also imagine this tent metaphor concretely as a locating, radically incarnational God who sweats it out with climate refugees all over the world. As God did in a cave with the political exile, John on Patmos, because Creator always dwells among the marginalized, awaiting restorative justice. The second motif I want to commend from John's culminating imaginary comes in the next and final chapter of the Apocalypse, his vision of the river of the water of life. This image effectively brackets the biblical canon, closing with a renewal of the primal water world that opened the creation story of Genesis, in which the ancient Hebrew poets confirm the ecological truth that water is the single most important component in the curation and continuation of life. No exceptions, which is why indigenous water walkers and water protectors chant Mini Wiconi, or Latin Americans resisting the privatization of water protest El agua es la vida. John's vision of an eschatological river contrasted starkly with the arid realities of his early readers. Those living in late first century Syro-Palestine would have been familiar chiefly only with the stagnant, torpid water found in small ponds, seasonal wells, catchment tanks, ritual baths, or clay pots. Domestic water quality was almost always poor. John's river, on the other hand, shines like crystal. This is not a description of supernatural qualities, but a poetic recognition of the fact that pure water indeed appears crystalline when it is flowing freely. Think of the dancing silver strands of a mountain stream. The phrase river of the water of life connotes exactly that, the running, bubbling, lively water of a spring or brook. Experiences of such living water were rare indeed for this desert people, which is why the Gospel of John introduces this well-known but overly spiritualized phrase, hudor zoon, during Jesus' encounter with a woman desperately seeking potable water at a failing well. But Revelation's river reaches further back in the tradition. It signals God's liberation in terms of the dramatic restoration of life to the land and those dwelling on it that was repeatedly envisioned by the Hebrew prophets. Those prophets knew that their homeland wasn't a desert. It had been desertified by imperial deforestation. Think of Isaiah's laments for the cedars of Lebanon. They further knew that the rehabilitation of a healthy hydrological cycle would restore habitat to wild creatures and riparian flora in their arid region. Isaiah 35's famous streams in the desert trope envisions a regreened world because water is flowing everywhere. While in 2nd Isaiah, Creator promises that both people, especially those marginalized, and forests will be renewed. Just as Pharaoh's army got drowned in the old Exodus story, so here the travails of oppression similarly disappear under life-giving water. Or Ezekiel 47's elaborate eschatological oracle of restoration, with its litany of how water will flow out of the temple, the renewed Gihon spring in each of the 4 directions, greening the world as it rises. We might call this prophetic tradition redemption as rehydration, and it articulates the dream of God. Upon this imaginary, John of Patmos draws deeply because it was the ancient core of his people's hope, which is why we Christians ought to swim in these waters as well. Moreover, John insists that the river of life flows through the middle of the great street of the city. The Greek term plateia connoted the main thoroughfare or plaza of a Hellenistic metropolis. Poignantly, earlier in the apocalypse, this plateia was the space of political violence, where the bodies of two prophets murdered by the imperial beast lay in public view for 3.5 days as a spectacle of state terror. Can you say Michael Brown in Ferguson? But now this main street has dissolved into the river of life that washes away not only the raw sewage that typically would have run down the gutters of an ancient platea, but also the blood spilled by imperial violence. Nature, healing, and society too. Oh, healing river. Indeed, throughout the apocalypse, water symbolizes liberation. Water of life is depicted as a spring in chapter 7, promising that the martyrs and the poor will end their hunger and thirst for justice because the Lamb will lead them to springs of living water. A pointed recontextualization of Isaiah 49:10, an oracle of God's emancipation of prisoners and the oppressed. John's equating this eschatological spring with the gift of life is more midrash on 2nd Isaiah. All who are thirsty, come for water, even if you have no money. An oracle rebuking the currency-dependent commodity markets of empire and reasserting the divine economy of gift and grace found in nature. But in Revelation 22, these living waters are springing up not from the ground, but from the throne of God and the Lamb. This echoes the psalmist's primal notion of Yahweh as a fount of life, almost as if Creator is themselves a water world, a cosmic womb. Finally, as in Ezekiel 47, John's freely and abundantly flowing river provides habitat for the tree of life, which yields spectacular fruits according to season. Its 12 crops correspond to the central symbolic number of the apocalypse, not to mention the traditional body politic of Israel, hearkening back to its roots in the tribal confederacy. And as in Ezekiel, the leaves of this tree are good medicine, specifically for the nations, because in the end, even empire is healed, but only when eclipsed by the ecology of life. John the Revelator has transplanted both cosmic tree and river from the primeval garden of Genesis into the heart of the eschatological city. But the former has transfigured the latter. The New Jerusalem is no longer recognizable as an urban space, at least as defined by our civilization, which builds over and against nature. It has been thoroughly permaculturized, a lush food forest taking the place of hardscape, all because the world has been saturated with the waters of life. Earth and her inhabitants are again beloved community, at the heart of which is Creator's encampment. The imaginary of both testaments, and we've only dipped into a few, offers profound articulations of social and environmental restorative justice from a people for whom dehydration and oppression were daily realities. Let us be clear, in our Judeo-Christian scriptures, redemption is restoration. So what do these ancient imaginaries have to teach the church about discipleship under climate crisis? Sure, technological responses are important, but they cannot alone rescue us. We will not geoengineer our way out of these plagues. Political action is essential, but must have deeper underpinnings than pragmatic self-interest. What is needed is a community that bravely diagnoses our civilizational dis-ease, draws deeply on prophetic imaginaries, and commits to building capacity for embracing programs for recovery. Because, as the generative somatic folks put it, imagination must be embodied in practice. So in our publishing work at BCM over the last quarter century, we've tried to explore pathways of practice in economic justice and sustainability, drawing on the ancient imaginary of Sabbath economics, of restorative justice, exploring the New Testament vision of reconciliation as a balancing of the scales, both ecologically and socially, drawing on the genius of Martin Luther King and the Southern freedom struggle, of ecological reinhabitation, looking at watershed discipleship as a new old bioregional way of mapping creation, Christian identity, and eco-justice practices, and most recently, decolonization, engaging the oldest violations on our continent in order to heal the haunted histories and continuing legacy of settler colonialism. Each of these projects tries to connect the biblical imaginary with contemporary struggles for justice and sensibility. And maybe I'll stop there and throw it back to you, and we will have a little conversation about what this means in practice.
Ted, thank you so much for the wisdom that you offer us. Reggie, I wonder if you have a song that might give us a chance to breathe in what we've just learned as we transition to conversation. So I noted as you were sharing about the book of Revelation, how the way you framed imagination, and this is what I heard in our earlier conversation with Rob and Keisha and Shannon, that our practice of imagination is one that is rooted. It's not about building ever more magnificent castles in the sky, but it's about having our creative capacities formed and shaped by the traditions that we come from, and also, and perhaps even most importantly, by the communities and places where we live. So if imagination for collective liberation is first local, I'm curious then for you, what does it mean to replace our imagination? And how does that change the way we understand our identity as humans, especially within kind of this water-formed identity that you just spoke to? And in particular, I'm curious what stories you could tell us from your own experience in life and ministry, or of other religious movements that already embody this sort of placed reimagination and what it means to look for a new heaven and a new earth, especially in response to this climate change moment.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Well, let me trace a little bit of my own journey, and I actually think I'm going to show a few more pictures because pictures are always more fun. When we, I'm just going to scooch ahead a little bit. This man right here, Baba Dioum, more than 50 years ago, at the time that Dr. King was naming the triplets, said something that really captured my attention when I learned it some 15 years ago. He said, "We won't save places that we don't love. And we can't love places that we don't know. And we don't know places that we haven't learned. So after 30 years of activism located in the inner city of several large metropolises, I decided that I wanted to be able to say yes as clearly as saying no, but what would I say yes to? And so as a fifth generation Californian, I knew that this landscape was in my bones, and we determined after a long search to find a little piece of Southern California that had not yet been destroyed by overdevelopment, where oak savanna and coastal chaparral were still relatively intact. And that is the Ventura River watershed. And what we did is we decided we bought a crappy old home. That's all we could afford, and we decided to turn it into a green building project, which included recycling an old cinder block home and also building a structurally insulated panel system, a highly green material addition on the south-facing side of which is a green screen of wild grape. So you see it before and after. You can't even see the building. So it cuts down 80% of the radiant heat before it even hits the building, which is important in our place because it gets triple digits. And we commenced doing a lot of the things that small neighborhood gardeners do. We installed solar, we gardened, we recycled pavers into patio, we painted wall murals. It was just a quarter acre. We installed the guest cabin made out of wood from urban forested lumber. We inherited only weeds, but those were transformed through permacultural redesign, swales, water-wise drip irrigation, gray water catchment, raised beds, and so on. A lot of things that most of you are familiar with. I don't want to forget to name my favorite moment, which was the construction of a bathtub vermiculture bin, which is here being blessed by an Anglican priest elder friend from New Zealand. And these worms do an amazing job. So that's at a personal discipleship level. We are still in the process of apprenticing ourselves to this watershed on this little piece of earth. And I have learned more theologically from the soil and from the watershed in these last 17 years than I ever certainly did in seminary. But when we push out a little bit, it's also not just personal, it's communal. And one of our important partners here in the bioregion is the Abundant Table Farm Project, which is a BIPOC-led multicultural small CSA farm, mostly volunteer labor. We curate a farm church circle there. This is a really important project around food justice and farm worker justice. We do our own versions of Church of the Wild. This is Bible study over a local grandmother oak. We are in frequent conversation with a local Chumash elder, Julie Tumamite, who we often share space with. Some of our young Latino colleagues, former interns, have turned this into a film project that is documenting water justice struggles in Honduras, specifically the story of Berta Cáceres, Detroit, with the water struggle there, and here in Ventura, and trying to connect the dots between these two things. So that's kind of at a communal level. Those are meaningful forms of engagement. And then at the structural level, we jumped in and got involved in the local watershed council. You'd be amazed at how many local places have watershed councils. This is structural work. But notice how the boundaries of our multiple watersheds in this area are completely disconnected from the political boundaries, right? Political boundaries are straight lines. And that is part of the problem with our politics. So watershed councils are part of changing that politics. And the most exciting project of this watershed council is the taking down of the Matilaha Dam. so few dams have been removed in the United States, whereas almost every major river in the US has been dammed. This one in our watershed was built in 1947. It became almost immediately obsolete, mostly silted up. The long task, which has taken 30 years and $30 million to try to get it removed, and it's still not gone yet, shows the huge cost of human beings trying to remediate our own bad engineering just to let nature be. But the taking down of a dam, as you all know, it has a huge impact, not only on the local ecology, but also on the community. So this was a major effort through the Watershed Council. And we're really excited that here's the hope for before and after picture of what that will look like. So these are just some local kinds of engagements. We could also talk about the Green Sabbath Project, which we're working with internationally. It's an interfaith international project that's trying to get folks just to observe one day of Sabbath. And then there's so many other kinds of projects that we, like many of you, are involved in, from denominational ecological programs, creation care programs, to the Poor People's Campaign, to nonviolent direct action undertaken by people all around. So these are all meaningful ways to express our discipleship within the context of specific watersheds, bioregions, and then beyond.
Thank you for that. And thank you for starting to kind of place how, or to describe to us how you've placed your spiritual imagination within the place that you live. I'm curious, what kind of the very first steps are in making that transition, especially for people. I think about how, and maybe this is just my experience of New England Protestantism, and I think we have quite a few New England Protestants in the room. We're often nicknamed God's chosen frozen, and there is a level of kind of abstraction to the way we think about issues of church and faith frequently. It's all stuff that lives in our head. I used to joke when I was a worship leader that one of my primary jobs was getting people to worship God from the neck down, because everything was all the way up here. And then also often very disconnected from our communities, where our buildings, the literal four walls of our buildings, became barriers to us being able to imagine in ways that were shaped by and in interdependence with the places where we lived. So for those of us whose imaginations may need a first step or a kickstart, where would you suggest to start when it comes to thinking about replacing our imaginations?
Well, let me suggest the 4 steps that we outline. And these 4 steps are as relevant to the journey of decolonization as they are to the journey of re-inhabitation, right? Because we've derogated peoples, we've derogated places. How do we repair? How do we practice repair? So we imagine 4 major steps of this journey. Again, it can be decolonization, re-inhabitation. One is to revision our place, our history, both personally and politically. And we call that reschooling, right? We literally have to forge places where we can talk about this stuff and deconstruct the narratives that are that have so deeply deformed us, and begin to reconstruct and to learn our history, and to learn the rudiments of colonization, to learn the rudiments of our watersheds. And so that, you know, the church is a great space for reschooling. We do an institute annually where we try to look at these issues. Secondly, the second step is restorative actions, relationship. And our Cree elder friend, Harry Lafon, pictured here at our last institute, emphasized that relationship building is essential to solidarity. That's as true for our relationship as settler colonialists with indigenous people as it is for our relationship with the creation. Relationship is essential to solidarity. So it's about spending time. This was talked about in multiple moments during this convocation, spending time with people and with place, to keep showing up, to move beyond our comfort zones, to always be ready to learn. So reschooling ourselves, rebuilding relationships, and then taking restorative action. It's crucial that we settlers and we alienated human beings listen to indigenous concerns, listen to the land, and show up in meaningful ways to support and accompany communities engaged in repair. I think many of you on the call probably know the Turtle Island-wide prayerful pilgrimages of Native water walkers, for example. And this takes place in many places. And what an amazing public liturgy that this is, where we are invited to join in prayerful walking of water. Obviously, in both US and Canada, resource extraction is a fraught area of contestation, particularly for Indigenous communities. So many faith leaders have been active in demonstrations. This picture here is two dear friends, a Mennonite leader and an Anglican priest, responding to an invitation from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation to stand against a pipeline project. So restorative actions, showing up, whether again, that's in solidarity with nature, Indigenous people, or both. And finally, repatriation and reparation. We talk about in our book, Healing Haunted Histories, the story of Stony Knoll and the young Chippewayan tribe in southern Saskatchewan, whose dispossession enabled the settlement of Elaine's direct ancestors, Mennonites at the turn of the last century, and how over the last 125 years, there's been a slow but steady attempt to build relations, to learn about the injustice, and then to begin to make repair. And just this summer, we were up there. A new storyboard on the site now tells the whole story of Indigenous dispossession. And through a great deal of education and advocacy, the Canadian government has finally recognized the young Chippewayan land claim. And Mennonite and Lutheran farmers locally are supporting their efforts for compensation. So all to say, these are 4 steps, right? Reschooling, relationship, reparative, restorative, solidarity, and reparations and repatriation. Those are the steps. But at the end of the day, and this is my favorite image, right? It's an image of small change, that everything we do counts. No step we take is too small, but no step we take is too great. What is important is that we are stepping as individuals, as communities of faith, as local communities, as institutions. Those are some of the ways that we can and must just keep walking this journey.
Thank you for that. I want to turn out to our gathered community and ask you all a question that I'm going to put in the chat, which is, what is one way that your watershed or local geography could shape your imagination? I invite you just to stick your answers in the chat right now to give us, Ched and I, a sense about how some of this sharing is beginning to land with you as you think about your own context. So what is one way that your watershed or local geography could shape your imagination? The rematriation of native seed stocks. And serving a community forest. I also note to our earlier prompt, sharing about planting natives and leaving a small backyard to thrive with local wildlife, doing restorative farming, caretaking neglected places, paying attention to circumscribed places, returning stewardship to native caregivers, walking as opposed to driving up and down a steep hill, walking around the water. I'm wondering, Ched, what's emerging for you as you're seeing some of these responses come into the chat?
Again, I think it's very important that we layer our responses, that we're engaged at multiple levels. The personal is important because that's where it hits home. That's where it intersects most existentially for us. But it's important that we move past just personal responses toward strategic structural interventions. And that's something that our churches have had a spotty history at, but we can, if we do enough reschooling and relationship building, we can join movements for actual structural change. One does not eclipse the other. The personal is political and vice versa. So all of these ideas are great. Our Watershed Discipleship book looks at lots of ways in which a parish can claim, a church can claim the watershed as its parish and can transform our liturgy, our prayer life, our symbolic life, our preaching life, our mission life in solidarity with not only that part of creation, but with the stories of First Peoples that land holds. So there's, in a lot of ways, it's the best of times and worst of times for our churches. And I think we're just now coming to see what this community of faith could do.
Well, actually, let's turn to our communities of faith for a moment and do some imagining for a place of possibility. So I have a question for you that's a close cousin to the what if questions that Rob introduced us to earlier today. If the church, the American church, didn't exist, and let's say very specifically the white Western American church didn't exist, and we had to invent it while rooted in our spiritual lineage, what do you imagine it would look like? For instance, what would discipleship formation look like? How would we make vows? How would our ritual and our liturgy and our worship be shaped?
If the church or other religious communities did not exist, we would have to reinvent them. And I think reinventing them is the long way around. And I'm not sure we've got the kind of time to curate the depth of our deep religious traditions. But think about this. This came up in a conversation last week in Minnesota with Lutheran pastors. If we were looking for a communal place to lament and to grieve, to confess and to repent, to sing to help regulate our cortisol levels, and dance, to pray personally, communally, publicly, to listen to ancient wisdom stories and deep traditions of all kinds, to practice mutual aid, to nurture spiritual practices, to center identity around memory, do this in memory of me, to have sacred water rites, baptism, and to act and serve locally with regional, national, and international networks. We've just described what churches are at their best and can be. So in my view, what if we, just as we have tended to live on top of our watersheds, not literate, not intimate, missing so much of the point, we talk about re-inhabiting the watershed to what Gary Snyder calls living into that place. What if we who live on top of our religious traditions actually live deeply into them, to re-inhabit them? And what we would find, I think, is all of the habits and practices with all their warts and flaws are the raw material to reimagine how to be human, how to be a part of God's dream of justice and repair. They're all there. We just need to reread our tradition, to ask new questions, to take some chances, to shake off some dust. And that is the necessary task. We've got this huge infrastructure. A lot of it's dysfunctional, but the bones and the vocabulary are there, in my view. And so it is our prayer and our hope that That is a central part of this kind of work, and I know we share that with BTS.
That's a beautiful image, and it reminds me, I'm currently renovating an island house, and the first time we went in, you could smell it from 15 feet away, and it was a place I walked through it once. I coughed for a week, and a lot of people told us there's no way for you to renovate it except with the match. But what I saw was the foundation was good, the frame was solid, the roof looked good, and if that was true, everything else could be negotiated. And as it turns out, everything else has been negotiated. And I think about our structures and the way we form ourselves are not the deepest part of our tradition. The congregation is not, that is not a foundational part of the way we have to organize Christian community. It can be reorganized. Our often religiously imperialist attitude towards our kin of different faiths or of no faith is not an essential part of our core theological conviction, and can be renegotiated into something that looks like collaboration and appreciative cooperation. And it strikes me as you say that actually what you're proposing is quite radical, because if we went down back to the foundation, we'd find a lot that we thought was foundational that we might actually have to tear out and put in something new or significantly renegotiate.
Amen. Well, you've been through that renovation, so have we here, and it's enervating and it's exhausting, but to keep our eyes on the prize that we can bring back to life and beauty and wholeness, that is worth the task. And that's what we've got to be doing. I don't think we're going to be able to invent traditions that are going to have the depth and substance that are the moral equivalent of what we're up against. New insights and experimentation is good, but we're also going to have to draw on these deep aquifers. So.
Thank you, Ched, for your wisdom, for this conversation. I'm wondering if you have a blessing you might be able to send us with.
I do. I've got an assignment for those of you who are preaching in pulpits and a benediction. The assignment is circle next a week from Sunday, October 16th, because you get to preach on one of the most amazing, rollicking gospel texts, one which focuses on the agency of women and of persistence. And this is just such a profound text in which Jesus talks about the powerful persistence of his mothers and grandmothers and how they can actually prevail against patriarchal domination. So this is coming up in your lectionary. If you're a lectionary person, I commend it strongly. And now for the benediction. Let me end as I began and say plainly that we are in an intergenerational life and death struggle with our terminal diseases. The political prisoner John of Patmos knew this in his bones. Just before he introduces his beatific vision of the divinely tented New Jerusalem and the river of life, he sounded a note of realism about struggle. Concluding his indictment of Babylon in Revelation 18 and 19, the Revelator reminds us that our greatest nonviolent weapon against principalities and powers who exploit our addictions and delusions is the sword of the mouth. It's a strange image, though perhaps not too different from Woody Guthrie writing on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." I take John's sword of mouth to mean all the ways that Jesus and the prophets modeled the power of truth telling by drawing on the imaginary of their deep tradition of sacred story. And that's why I think it's worth searching our scriptures in our quest for militant, fierce hope. Unsurprisingly, this wisdom is best captured by an Indigenous writer, the novelist Leslie Marmon Silko, with whose exhortation I conclude, having adopted it as something of a confession of faith. "I will tell you something about stories," said the elder. "They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They're all we have, you see, all we have. Fight illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Their evil is mighty, but it cannot stand up to our stories. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ched. Reggie, do you have some music to offer us?
I do. And thank you, Ched, for rekindling that spirit. It's a mighty long way over yonder. It's a mighty long way from there to here. We've got to take it just one step at a time so that we can make that walk from there to here. Words written in honor of John Lewis, whose life lived into the mission that we've been so talking about. It's a mighty long way over yonder. It's a mighty long way from there to here. We're gonna take it, oh yes, one step at a time, so that we can make that walk from there to here. It's a mighty long way over yonder, a mighty long way from there to here. We're gonna take it just one step at a time, so that we can make that walk from there to here. When you got a dream, you got to stand up and shout it loud and clear. What's that I'm hearing? It's the voice of the people singing that we can make that walk from there to here. Now every child born is a revolution with a song inside. Some won't hear it, oh, but some hear nothing else. They sing night and day just to keep that song alive. It's a mighty long way over yonder. It's a mighty long way from there to here. We're gonna take it, oh, just one step at a time, so that we can make that walk from there to here. Well, we're gonna take it just one step at a time, so that we can make that walk from there to here.
Thank you, Reggie.